Welcome to The Workplace, a podcast by CalChamber. I'm Matthew Roberts, Associate General Counsel for Labor and Employment with the California Chamber of Commerce. Hello, listeners. While we continue to monitor new employment law proposals winding their way through the legislature, we always have to be vigilant and continue to keep an eye on emerging trends for current compliant issues. One such issue that has caught my eye recently are things related to age stratification in our workforce. So the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics projects that we will actually see an increase in workers ages 55 and older, including a rise in those older than 65 as a percentage of the overall workforce. And this is due to a variety of factors, of course. Things like longevity, a desire for a second career different than the first career that we went through for all of our years of our lives, or, of course, economic reasons such as cost of living considerations. As mentioned here previously, we are also seeing an increase in age-related litigation in the workplace, especially allegations of age-related harassment and discrimination. Further, the U.S. Senate has recently moved along a bill aimed at ending forced arbitration for age-related employment claims across the country, and the courts continue to explore these kinds of claims on a regular basis. So, to discuss this emerging trend, we welcome back CalChamber's employment law subject matter expert, Vanessa Greene. Thanks for joining me today, Vanessa.
Thanks, Matthew. Always a pleasure to join you.
So let's start with the courts because, you and I are lawyers and we're nerds and we love court decisions, right? It's what we do this job for.
We live and breathe for this stuff.
So, Vanessa, the California Court of Appeal took actually a really in-depth look recently at a case that involved an employee who felt that they were harassed and discriminated against because of their age. But before we really get into the nitty-gritty there in terms of what the court was looking at factually, Vanessa, what do we look at just legally in an age discrimination claim?
So they're both federal law and state law that come into play here. So federally, we have the Age Discrimination Employment Act, which is also known as the ADEA. And then under state law, we have the Fair Employment and Housing Act, FEHA. Both of those prevent workplace harassment and discrimination on the basis of age. Interestingly, though, these protections only apply to folks who are 40 years of age or older. So all of the young whippersnappers out there under the age of 40 don't actually have a legal basis to bring an age discrimination claim. Sorry, folks. Otherwise, age discrimination claims are pretty similar to other harassment or discrimination claims in the sense that if an employee is treated unfavorably or unfairly because of their age, then they have grounds to bring a claim.
Okay, great. And I always kind of joke about this in harassment training, right? I say, if you're younger than 40, raise your hand. And then we talk about whether or not they think it's okay if I were to pick on them for being a younger employee, right? Like, when you grow up a little bit or when you get a little bit more experience, sport or tiger or junior or all these kinds of things, it always seems kind of counterintuitive that you can't bring an age discrimination claim. And one thing before we really jump into the case I'd like to address is, even though they're not legally protected, Vanessa, what do you think about that kind of conduct towards younger employees?
Yeah, so I think even though they're not legally protected, we don't want to treat them like that in the workplace, right? And I think most employers are going to say, hey, that goes against our policy. You may not be able to bring an age discrimination claim, but you can't be calling each other names and making fun of younger people in the workplace.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important background that we keep in our mind as we go forward with this episode today, because we will talk about a lot of the positives around, this generation stratification that, we'll talk about. But with that background, let's jump into the case, Hoagland versus Sierra Nevada Memorial Miners Hospital. Vanessa, factually, what happened in this case that gave rise to these claims?
So, spoiler alert, this is a case containing some pretty disturbing facts. So what happened is this employee, her name's Jessica Hoagland, she brought a age discrimination claim, and she had worked her way up to becoming the sole laboratory supervisor at the hospital where she worked at the age of 56. And shortly after she got promoted, Rhonda Horn was hired as the director of clinical operations at the hospital, and she became Hoagland's new direct supervisor. And that's when the trouble begins. Horn, who was herself age 50, she wasted no time making Hoglin's life really difficult over a period of years. She constantly made derogatory comments about Hoglin's age and appearance, calling her things like sloppy and old-fashioned. She would say things like, "Oh, Hoglin, you've been at this hospital since the dark ages," and then criticize her for not using things like scheduling software. But sadly, she didn't actually provide Hoglin with any training on how to use that software. She made comments like, "Well, I want to hire babies because they're easier to train." It was clear that she preferred training younger employees. Pretty cringy stuff. So just when you think it can't get any worse, Hoglin took a leave of absence from work to care for her sister who had cancer. And then when she returned to work after her leave, Horn moved Hoglin's workspace to a wheelchair storage closet in a separate building that had no windows or ventilation. So what's even more disturbing about this case, Matt, is that Hoglin had reported Horn's behavior to HR multiple times, but her complaints were dismissed. No investigation was conducted. Instead, HR had suggested that she seek individual therapy. Unbelievable. And side note for employers, we don't want to tell our employees they need therapy. Okay?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about age here, but now you're starting to tread into all sorts of dangerous waters, not to mention just like the whole failure to investigate thing, but unbelievable here. So what happened with Hoglin's employment, Vanessa?
Yeah, so after about 6 years of this kind of treatment, the hospital decided to reduce its workforce, and influenced by Horn's very biased evaluations about Hoglin and misrepresentations about her role, they terminated Hoglin at the age of 62, and they replaced her with a much younger employee. And the reasons they gave for her termination really appeared unfounded. They said things like she was lacking computer skills and she was only managing the outreach staff, which really was untrue. So she felt like she was pushed out due to her age, understandably, and she sued them for age discrimination and harassment. And the court ended up siding with Hoglin and awarded her nearly $2.5 million in damages, which the appellate court confirmed.
Wow. Yeah. So like you said, a little bit cringy, maybe a lot of bit cringy. And I think the facts really go a long way to showing how really either directly or indirectly a person can demonstrate their discriminatory motive, whether it be age or any of the other number of protected classes we have. The one quote that really hooks me is this phrase, "I want to hire babies," right, Vanessa? We're not actually hiring babies. But
Right.
like you said, what that means is I prefer younger employers. So while you're not saying, "Oh, Hoglin, you're terrible because you're old or you're slow or you can't handle this technology or it's time for you to retire," instead, you're indirectly telling her that she's not worthy of being an employee there because you're saying, "I'm preferring younger employees." So that's really what struck me. Secondarily, what struck me about this is how much liability just an individual supervisor can create. Because like you told me, she's director of clinical operations. She's not CEO. She's not human resources. But it sounds like she's driving the entire action here. And so these supervisors can create substantial liability for us when they're unchecked, and when human resources doesn't necessarily do the proper response to stop the conduct in this case. So Vanessa, give me some takeaways here from this case and things that our employers can look at and make sure that we're evaluating our processes.
Yeah, well, I think you nailed two of them right there, right? We don't want to make these generalizations about older workers. I mean, obviously saying things like, "I want to hire babies because they're easier to train," is an indirect implication of age discrimination. And the comments like that just really don't belong in the workplace. And I completely agree with you, Matt, about supervisors. Supervisors have a significant influence on the workplace, both positive and negative, right, if left unchecked. And so we really want to make sure that we're properly training our supervisors. And at a minimum, California supervisors need to complete the mandatory harassment prevention training every 2 years. That's just at a minimum, right? We also want to train them on how to communicate professionally, how to document their decisions properly, how to avoid biases when they're making decisions. So really important takeaways. Some other thoughts, they really botched this whole failure to investigate, right? When we get when we get complaints made in the workplace, we need to investigate them promptly and thoroughly. And that's not just a best practice, that's required under state law. And so the fact that Haugland complained to HR years before her termination, more than once, if the company had actually conducted a proper investigation, they might have nipped this situation in the bud before it turned into a $2.5 million liability. And the final takeaway for employers here is monitor your workplace culture. And what I mean by that is employers really need to regularly assess and address potential issues going on in their workplace. And this can be done a number of different ways. You could conduct regular employee feedback surveys. You can hold focus groups to understand your employees' concerns. It's just really critical that we have a pulse on what's happening in our workplace, because ignorance is not bliss in situations like this.
Yeah, absolutely. And as is pretty apparent, this case holds a fair warning for everybody in terms of what happens if we're not taking stock of what our supervisors are doing, what we are doing ourselves as leaders in the organization to ensure that our motivations are above board. And so while we're obviously, from our perspective, very interested in making sure that we take our lessons from this from a compliance standpoint, I'm also always interested in how we can proactively avoid this conduct just in the first place, right? We can train. We can address complaints and we can do all this stuff, but there's other soft skills about this that we can do just to avoid this kind of conduct in the first place. And that's really why I like having you on here, Vanessa, rooted from your prior experience in a human resources role. So talk to me about what employers and human resources professionals can look at in their own workplaces as worker ages are starting to play more and more into the workplace dynamics.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So this idea of age within the workplace, this is known as generational diversity. And that really refers to the presence of multiple generations interacting together within a single workforce. And in today's workforce, we have 5 different generations that are all working. We have traditionalists, that's like the World War II generation. We have baby boomers, we have Gen X, we have millennials, and we have Gen Z, the newest generation in the workforce. And each of these generations grew up in a radically different time. And that shapes not only how they see the world, but also how they show up in the workplace. And so, as you can probably imagine, this generational diversity, while it brings opportunities, it can also bring some challenges to today's workforce.
Yeah, and I think the case we discussed, kind of draws some of those challenges out, which of course are these stereotypes around different generations. Again, older people not as handy with technology, slower to learn. Younger employees are more motivated, hungry, energetic, anxious to get at this. And I really find that the motivations between the generations have kind of changed too. I remember, my dad held down the same position for 25 years in his job. And this was because he valued job security. It's my job. I want it. I'm going to continue on, loyalty and these kinds of things. And then you fast forward and get to a generation like mine where we're just a lot more comfortable jumping from here to there in search of situations that more appeal to what our motivations are, which is not necessarily job security. So, Vanessa, what are a couple discrete challenges and solutions to those challenges that you currently see to this 5-generation workforce?
Yeah, there's definitely some challenges when it comes to managing this multi-generational workforce. Before we dive into those, I just want to mention a quick note that when we talk about these different generational traits and preferences, these are really broad generalizations. They're not universal truths. And so listeners should really take this with a grain of salt, use this as a starting point to understand the broader issues. But we don't want to rely solely on generational labels for managing people, because traits and preferences can really vary widely within not only each generation, but from person to person. That being said, these labels can help provide us with some general guideposts for this topic. So that was my quick soapbox there. All right, let's look at some of the common multi-generational workforce challenges. So First challenge that I see is communication styles or preferences being different. And for example, older generations may tend to prefer more face-to-face communication, while stereotypically speaking, younger generations might prefer more digital methods of communication. And a potential solution for this is for employers to use a mix of different communication methods in their workplace. That way, their folks have an option to select the method that works for them, right? They can pick their preference. The other thing employers can do is provide training on effective communication skills. That way, this helps everybody in the workplace improve their communication. Now, another challenge that I see a lot is, and you mentioned this, Matt, having varied comfort levels with technology. And that could be based on not only the different generations, but just on an individual level as well. So a solution for this is for employers to offer continuous technology training and support for all employees. Just remember that these training opportunities should be equal, right? We never want to deny an employee a training opportunity because of their age or make assumptions that they need or don't need this training because of their age. So open that door for everybody to get trained as needed. Another challenging area that employers see is employees having different expectations for feedback. And so stereotypically speaking, older generations might be more familiar or more comfortable with a more formal review process for feedback, whereas younger generations tend to prefer like regular check-ins or maybe a little bit less formal feedback methods. And so employers can tackle this challenge by customizing their feedback methods to really suit the individual preference of the employee that they're giving the feedback to. And it's always important to ensure that you're having that regular constructive communication with all of your employees. Customize the method that you're doing it to fit their needs. And then lastly, I'll mention one more challenge because this ties right into the case that we discussed. This is when we have stereotyping or generational biases in the workplace that lead to misunderstandings and conflict and turnover. And so employers can work to overcome these types of challenges by providing diversity training and really promoting a culture of inclusivity and respect. We really want to make sure we're fostering a culture where, while similarities are appreciated, the differences are also appreciated and respected as well. And I think this really starts from the top down. So upper management needs to be the one to set the example here. If it's not happening at the top, it's probably not going to happen at all.
Yeah. And, Vanessa, I like to talk about myself a little bit in this situation because, of course, when we came into the workforce, we were the youngest generation coming into the workforce. And just from my perspective, I'm willing to own this. I worked fast. I thought, older, more experienced workers who were actually in charge of me maybe didn't know as well as I knew, which is kind of just a common thing that happens here. But something that I make this joke, when you're older, when you grow up and you get more experience, experience is experience, Vanessa. And so in addition to these challenges that you've talked about, there's a lot of positives about generational diversity, especially related to that experience. So Vanessa, let's go through a few of the positives to close out today.
Yeah, let's do that. And I want to share a story too, Matt. I love that you shared that. And I'm thinking back to my first law job. And, you work, when you're an associate attorney, you work with all these different partners, right? Of different ages and different styles. And one of the partners that I worked with, he just was not an emailer at all. He was the oldest partner in the firm. And I tried to email him several times and I just never heard back. And I thought he hated me. And somebody finally told me, Vic doesn't read his email. Like, you have to go down the hall and talk to him. So, those differences can show up in different ways, right?
Right.
Okay. So some great positive opportunities that we can think about in terms of generational diversity. Employers have a great prime opportunity for knowledge sharing and training. So consider pairing your junior employees with more experienced employees for really effective succession planning for the future, right? We want them to be trained on that knowledge and get that experience before our more seasoned employees exit. our workplace. Additionally, we can implement mentorship programs. Those can be really beneficial in the workplace. This allows the younger employees to pair up with the more experienced employees and really have an exchange of skills and fostering that mutual growth from both directions. And then lastly, if we intentionally form diverse teams in our workplace that really purposefully combine various experience levels and skills and perspectives, we can really harness those differences to boost things like problem solving and innovation in our workplace.
I think that's awesome. So Vanessa, thank you really so much for highlighting so many excellent tips for integrating and improving our workforce, regardless of the age of all of our workers.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here, Matt.
And thank you, listeners, for joining this discussion on the workplace. Please share this episode and subscribe to CalChamber's podcast by visiting calchamber.com.